Hello everyone and welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick and this is a show about Canadian culture and the way it informs this nation's history. Today we are going to be going back in time, at least thematically. Kind of. Through the use of John Richardson's 1832 novel Wacousta, we are going to cover a topic that takes place quite a while before the time we are at in our chronology. That is, Pontiac's Rebellion. There are reasons for covering it now rather than earlier, and we'll get to that in due time. Richardson's novel is sometimes considered to be the first in Canada, and possibly the first with more implied homosexual symbolism. How's that for a Pride Month topic? But this is subject to debate, and regardless, the book will be the uniting element in a discussion about hardships in Canada and how people have dealt with them. How exactly do you move on from certain traumas and make something from them? These traumas can be as vast as a fight against the wilderness or as specific as a rebellion. But the central idea remains. How do you come to terms with Canada's past and its potential future and kind of coalesce the two together? By giving a fictional spin on a historical event that Richardson clearly held dear, the author attempts to come to terms with the quite grandiose nature of Canada's development by channeling the rapidity and excitement of such a colonial project, and even gives it a supernatural allure at times. Focusing on an event that would have directly impacted Native lives, and European lives in Canada, and fictionalizing it in sometimes baffling ways, Richardson was, I believe, attempting to capture the dizzying nature of the Canadian project. The author is no stranger to writing about Native Americans, after all, if you remember our discussion about him in the War of 1812 episode. But where his previous work that we've touched upon, Tecumseh, was much more romantic and emotional for little purpose other than to bring a sentimental outlook onto Native plights, Wacousta actually tries to do something much more impactful and intentional with the subject. The novel is using an intense and oft-romanticized moment to show how British North America can move forward, and it does so by using the difficult aspects of both Native American lives and of European garrison life. We'll get to that concept later. If we go off what I said in the final minutes of the previous episode, there is a continuity here. While I am not talking specifically about a plan for a group per se, I'm talking about a mentality, an idea, or even a proposition as to how the North American colonies can integrate their current situation, both the good and the bad, into a future that takes account of and remembers it, and even fights for it on a certain level, but that goes at it from the view of advancing into the future. This works into the idea of various visions of Canada that I touched upon last time. Certainly, not everyone had Native Americans in mind when the future of the colonies came up. Far from it. And as we'll move forward, we'll see what the official policy concerning them will be. And it's a violent one, to be sure. But in the spirit of approaching multiple viewpoints, John Richardson's novel, considered by some critics to be the Canadian equivalent of The Last of the Mohicans, and by far his greatest endeavor into the literary scene, takes these people into consideration when imagining a path for Canada. Before I begin, I want to say right here that I will often be using terms like civilization, savagery, wilderness, and other such words that have come to be loaded in meaning, especially in a North American context. I am aware of these pressures, and you'll notice that in past episodes I have placed air quotes around them when using them. Because the terms are used more often in this episode, often in their traditional sense and not in their derogatory one, I decided to give a blanket statement here and now that they are all in air quotes. I found it tedious to repeat it every time, and it kind of broke the rhythm of the show. Just assume that they are there. If you want to support and help the show, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or checking out the recommended reading list in the description. If you buy a book through one of the links on that page, there's a kickback to me at no extra cost to you. Anyway, on with the show. I think the best place to start this whole discussion is with a brief overview of what Pontiac's Rebellion was, right? That's logical. So let's dial back the clock to 1763. I feel we often have to go back to that date from a later chronological point, and I apologize if that's confusing for some, but there weren't a lot of cultural items or literature that we can use from that time to discuss our events more interestingly. And also, 1763 is kind of this turning point that will have an impact for things later on, so that's why we're looking back on them now. Going back to this pivotal time in Canadian history, 1763 was the year that Canada was officially ceded to the British from the French. We've talked about that before, you know it, I know it, moving on. What's important in this case is the change in interactions between the natives and European powers. Under the French regime, certain Native Americans were allied with the power, and as a result, were able to trade more freely with them. The trade could be to obtain something like guns, for example, in exchange for, say, pelts. For a while, though, things changed with those trading interactions under the British regime. You see, one of the understandings that the French and natives had was that in exchange for using territory that many natives still understood as being theirs, not that of the French, that the latter would give customary gifts. It's been cited and recounted as an example of trade between the two peoples, and indeed there was some of that, but in this case, it is not to be confused with an example of the natives ceding territory over to the French. It's more of like a rental, if you will. You want to use this land and hunt on it? Fine. It's still ours, but for a few guns, you can use it. There would be some confusion over the years between the French and the indigenous populations that they considered to be allies, but that is the gist of it. Then came Field Marshal Geoffrey Amherst. Amherst was, as Commander-in-Chief of the British forces, among the leading figures that led Britain in its conquest of New France, being at the head of the armies that dealt some of the most decisive blows in the war that lasted from 1754 to 1763. He is among those credited with taking Louisbourg, near Cape Breton, and Montreal. As a result of his military conquests and endeavors, which at the time were lauded, many places in eastern Canada bear his name, including a street in Montreal that was changed in 2019, and a town in Nova Scotia, which is considering changing the name as well. The reasons for the name change segue pretty nicely into our topic today. Nova Scotia and Montreal officials are not changing things up just for the sake of it, or because they disagree fundamentally with the British conquest. Although, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibilities for a place like Montreal to have some people with that opinion. The name of Amherst is being changed because of his actions after the conquest, during Amherst's short time as governor of the province of Quebec. Notoriously, he chose to end the relations and agreements that had been set up by the French and the Native Americans, effectively leaving the latter with nothing as the British moved on to their lands. What's more, as an extension of this decision to more concretely remove the native element from the North American landscape, Amherst was among the first to promote a form of bacteriological warfare. That is, the use of smallpox-infected covers that were given to the indigenous populations as gifts of sorts. Huge air quotes here. And these covers would kill them in droves, as they had no immune system that could fight against such an invisible threat. So hey, he was a genocidal governor, but at least he made room for the British to settle. That deserves a street name? Yeah, screw that. Amherst is what I politely like to call a huge racist and the worst type of person. I know that the upkeep of certain figures through the likes of statues and plaques can be a controversial topic for some, and I won't get into it here. But feel free to use social media and the email address if you really feel the need to discuss whether Amherst needs to be remembered in that way. It's actually a pretty topical subject now that with all the protests going on and statues actually being taken down for that very reason. So it could be interesting actually. Anyway, Amherst's actions did have consequences, And this is where Pontiac comes in. An Odawa leader, by the way, this is where the word Ottawa comes from for the city, from around the Great Lakes area, who was one of the many Native American leaders who led a rebellion against the actions of the British that were embodied by Amherst. It's very important to note right at the start that Pontiac was not alone in his rebellion, despite it being named after him. Many tribes and native nations were fighting alongside each other, but it was not a centralized movement in and of itself. Pontiac was simply one of the better known examples, especially from the British point of view, and his name has been used as shorthand to reference the series of conflicts that the indigenous populations and the British went through starting in 1763. Much like Amherst not being the sole decision maker in the British actions in North America, Pontiac was not the grand mastermind of the rebellion. It's a historical shorthand that allows us to talk more succinctly about these events in a shorter podcast. But the rebellion itself that Pontiac was a part of is more of a way to get a discussion about wider issues in Canada off the ground. In fact, historian Richard White sums up the conflict and opens up to its aftermath pretty concisely in his 1991 book, The Middle Ground: Indians, Republics, and the Great Lakes Region. I'll read part of it to you with a warning that White, as you see from the title, uses the term Indian, which was still widely in use in America at the time and to some extent still is. Quote, "The events of Pontiac's Rebellion are well known. In 1763, Indians from the Senecas, west to the Illinois, and from the Chippewas, south to the Delawares, attacked the recently occupied British posts in the Pays d'en Haut, which is Canada, and with the exceptions of Niagara, Detroit, and Fort Pitt, took them all. By the end of the year, British reinforcements raised the sieges of the surviving forts. They did not crush the rebellion, but stymied it, and it slowed to an inconclusive halt." Then later he writes, quote, "Pontiac's world was a continuation of the old world of controversies between the Alliance and the Republics. The British assertion of conquest and subjection forced both sides to create political alternatives of the relationship between whites and Indians. Neither side could, however, think in isolation. They could only, as it were, think together. And so the British and the Indians found themselves moving back onto the middle ground." End quote. The middle ground that White refers to is namely included in the 1763 Royal Proclamation, a document that we have talked a few times about on the show, and the basic purpose of which was to establish the new status quo after the British had officially beaten France in Europe and North America. What is most remembered is that New France became British, and the rights of the Canadiens in that land were somewhat fleshed out. For our purposes, something else happened. J.R. Miller of the University of Saskatchewan writes that, quote, "The proclamation specified that lands west of Quebec and the 13 colonies were Indian territories. It also said that no individual could negotiate with Indians for purchase of these lands that were reserved for their use." End quote. Now, this is an interesting piece of legislation, first because it is one of the things that would anger the future Americans who wanted to expand. But more to the point, because it creates a clearer frontier distinction. Just how much the proclamation would be respected is quite the discussion, and won't be covered here. Stay tuned for an episode on Canadian treaties. It's going to be a rough. But for the time being, and for at least some time, until about when Richardson was writing Wacousta, there was an effective place where civilization, as the British and Canadians saw it, ended, and the wilderness began. What we'll see with Richardson's novel is how that distinction is played up in Canada and has influenced the Canadian mindset to the point of creating a way that inhabitants united based on their environment. Let's of course begin with a look at the novel and its story before analyzing it. There are actually 3 volumes that make up the entire story of Wacousta, which is also known as The Prophecy, or A Tale of the Canadas. Was it entirely necessary for there to be that much text? No. The story didn't really need to be that long. In fact, not at all. But writers wrote long things back then, and the novel was a relatively recent phenomenon. So people were still getting a feel about what you put in or keep out. And also, it's not like there was a TV or radio to entertain people with. Books were padded out because you wanted to look erudite, and because you wanted it to endure for a while as a piece of entertainment. It's not all that surprising that most editions have been shortened or edited down since its initial printing. There's a lot of fluff. But that's really beside the point. Audiences were presented with the volumes of Wacousta starting in 1832, and it tells the story of a broken romance, revenge, survival, identity, and war, right around the time of Pontiac's Rebellion. I mentioned at the top of the show that Wacousta is sometimes referred to as being the first Canadian novel, or at least written by a Canadian-born person. And I feel like dispelling that right here. In 1824, St. Ursula's Convent was published in Kingston, Upper Canada, by Julia Beckwith. It's not a great book. It goes from shipwrecks to possible incest to scheming priests with a weird sidetrack into the 18th century in Europe, and it's mostly remembered for its historical significance. But I just wanted to mention it here, and it'll probably be the only time I do, just to set the record straight. Alright, on with Wacousta. The story itself is not told in a chronological order, and as Professor Dennis Duffy of the University of Toronto puts it, quote, "The complex plot of this forest Gothic romance by John Richardson unfolds through surprise and flashback. Each chapter opens up with an astonishment that is followed by an explanation." End quote. The novel is written in not too dissimilar a fashion, seemingly as Memento, right? The movie from like 2000. That's a timely reference, right, that people get? Alright, never mind. But it's also written in the same fashion as a pulp magazine that would publish parts of a story every issue and would need to grab the reader's attention so as to keep them coming back for more. This is how many novels were initially written at the time, in individual parts that would be used to gather audience reception before moving on to the next one. I hadn't found any information about whether Wacousta received that treatment, but regardless, it seems to be how it was written. Perhaps Richardson wanted to maintain that style just so readers would keep going? I don't know. For the sake of logic and ease, I will recount the significant parts of the story in chronological order. Because, let's face it, we can cover the 4 or 5 major points and go from there because, God, there are flourishes. Seriously, listen to this part just to get an idea. Quote, "Almighty Providence," aspired the sinking Clara. "Can it be that the human heart can undergo such change? Ha ha! Such cold, pompous insolence amuses me," vociferated Wacousta. Damn. So anyway, as you can gather from that passage, Wacousta is actually a person, but one whose name was not always that. In the 1740s, when the earliest events of the novel take place, we learn of the Scot, Sir Reginald Morton, a friend of the British Colonel Charles de Haldimar, and of the woman who Morton loves, Clara Beverley. But soon, tragedy would strike in the life of Sir Morton, as he discovers, after years of fighting in wars across the world, that his one-time ally, de Haldimar, was married to Clara. To make matters even worse, Morton is framed for a crime he did not commit, and lost his commission as a soldier. He exiles himself to France, and finally goes to Canada, where in 1759 he would fight in the hyper-romanticized Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Meanwhile, de Haldimar and his bride would live near the Great Lakes, and raise a family on the frontier just as the British were taking over completely in North America. His post is as the commander of Fort Detroit, right around 1763. De Haldemar's post is one of the first to be dreadfully attacked by Pontiac and his forces, which also include the mysterious, hulking, and absolutely brutal figure of Wacousta, who advises Pontiac on where to strike next in his rebellion. Wacousta, as the novel continues, would haunt de Haldemar and his family in sequences that are filled with an abundance of gory descriptions that fit alongside the likes of Shelley's Frankenstein, probably the most famous example of the Gothic genre that Richardson pulls from, that Dennis Duffy mentioned earlier. The novel ends in the death of Wacousta, but also of those framed as the villains, Charles and Clara de Haldemar, as well as their children, rather confusingly called Charles and Clara as well. It is towards the end that the reader discovers, to the shock and awe of all, that the dreaded Wacousta is indeed Sir Reginald Morton, so driven by revenge for the slight caused by his friend that he has quote-unquote gone native. And thus ends the chronological tale of Wacousta. So, among the overlong exposition and the courtship dramas that seemingly never end, Wacousta nevertheless has many reasons to continue to be looked at with a critical eye. The depiction of a noble spirit who is maddened by injustice and who goes out of his way to bring down horrors against a slight that most surely did not deserve such a reaction is but one aspect. There are also a series of sexual undertones between Morton and de Haldemar that have been used in discussions about LGBTQ literature in Canada, and of course the demonstration of the monstrous nature is evident. I want to use some of these ideas and examine more deeply and critically John Richardson's work, with special attention to something that has been coined as Garrison Mentality. As we touched on in the War of 1812 episode, when we discussed Richardson's other work, Tecumseh, are you starting to see a trend in his topics yet? The author was a major in the British Army during that conflict. It most certainly influenced his outlook on life, of the Native American situation, and of the plight of the soldiers and colonists living on the frontier. Now, as you saw from my overview, the novel has little to do with Pontiac's Rebellion itself. So why did I choose to examine the conflict and that moment in time through such a lens? Well, it mostly has to do with what I highlighted earlier in the passage by Richard White. The rebellion itself served to enact change in the way British and native populations interacted in North America, as both of them came to understand that it was no longer an option to live in isolation from one another. The British could not cut off ties to the Native Americans on the frontier, and the natives were in a position where they couldn't either. At least, not cold turkey like Amherst attempted to do. I touched upon Pontiac's Rebellion now in our chronology because this is where things come to a more recognizable turning point. And Wacousta shows that turning point. Where the rebellion forced a type of cohabitation, Wacousta shows the potential fear that comes with such a cohabitation from both sides of the coin. As we have seen in the past episodes, the West was being moved into more concretely by the 1830s. Many British settlers and the slew of propaganda that accompanied efforts to expand the British Empire understood their role as that of civilizing the wilderness. But where Upper and Lower Canada and the Maritimes had been relatively stable for the last few years, the westward expansion of the British would awaken a fear that has been described by famed critic Northrop Frye, and later used by his student, Margaret Atwood, to describe the feeling of unease that Canadians represent early in their society and literature. This is a fear of what lies in the wilderness, and a fear of the outsider that is not necessarily a kind of xenophobia, but more of a generalized fear of what can come in from the cold and disturb the society that was being built. this society that is supposedly stable and safe. The West was unknown and could hold any number of terrors. That is why Wacousta, with its monster coming in from the past, a monster that was once Scottish and proper, is the perfect way to approach this subject. The garrison is a way to protect oneself from that outside, but it is not always successful. The first reference, or at least articulated reference, to this phenomenon, in a literary sense, is, as I mentioned, from Northrop Frye, in a conclusion he wrote to a book called A Literary History of Canada. The concept would be developed much further in works like Survival, but I think Frye sums up the general idea very well, even if he doesn't quite ascribe a name to it. Here's a passage. Quote, "Yet the conquest of nature has its own perils for the imagination, in a country where the winters are so cold and where conditions of life have so often been bleak and comfortless, where even the mosquitoes have been described as mementos of the fall. I have long been impressed in Canadian poetry by a tone of deep terror in regard to nature. It is not a terror of the dangers of discomforts or even the mysteries of nature, but a terror of the soul at something that these things manifest. The human mind has nothing but human and moral values to cling to if it is to preserve its integrity or even its sanity. Yet the vast unconsciousness of nature in front of it seems an unanswerable denial of those values." And later on he'll write, "A garrison is a closely knit and beleaguered society, and its moral and social values are unquestionable. In a perilous enterprise, one does not discuss causes or motives. One is either a fighter or a deserter. In such a society, the terror is not for the common enemy. The real terror comes from when the individual feels himself becoming an individual, pulling away from the group, losing the sense of driving power that the group gives him, aware of a conflict within himself far subtler than the struggle of morality against evil." End quote. So that was a lot. And this double type of fear is where we will return to Wacousta. It might be obvious to say so, but in that story, the renegade soldier who became a native boogeyman, Reginald Morton, or the titular Wacousta, represents, as Dennis Duffy once again mentions, the, quote, terror of savagery lurking in the Canadian wilderness. This aspect forces readers to literally wonder what they will become if they stray too far from the safety of their own garrison, of their civilization that keeps them protected from too much change. But there's a certain jab at how easy it was for Morton to turn to that apparently wild side. I think Richardson was commenting on just how fragile this concept of British civilization truly is. That behind the forts and stone walls, those structures that were easily pierced by the Native Americans, sometimes, there are but men who are just as fallible as the natives they are supposedly trying to bring into a better world. This is ultimately the duality that Wacousta, as a way to understand the elements at play in Pontiac's Rebellion and its aftermath, leaves us with. Yes, you could analyze it in a straightforward way and ask who the real monster is. Is it the unknown lurking in the shadows, or is it the conquering army that will stop at little to assuage its fears of the unknown by doing all it can to eliminate anything that resembles it? Ultimately, the answer is, it depends where you're standing. The aim of this episode was to show that a true duality was forming in Canada. Well, there was more than one, but I'm not talking about the question of French and English coexisting in the country here. I'm referring more specifically to how the people, especially those on the frontier, were struggling with situating themselves in this newly emerging reality that we've been discussing today. I've been setting up for the past few episodes this idea that Canadians are moving away from being British folks in North America. But in doing so, the natural reflex is to turn to the unknown in search of what makes us different. That unknown is the scary part of this story. The eternal question, one that has plagued the Canadian culture and identity for years after our point in time, is what if it fails? What if it turns us into the monster that we fear? Whatever that may be. The British civilization in Canada is flawed and hypocritical, but it feels safe. Wacousta and the history of Pontiac's Rebellion pair well together, not just because the book uses the time as a setting, but because the people involved in both stories must answer the same questions. While time and distance has undoubtedly placed the likes of Amherst into the category of a villain, the point remains that he was driven by the very fears that I have been talking about, that of the savagery of the wilderness. The same goes for Pontiac and his men, who feared the wave of civilization. What Richardson attempts to do is explain and find a solution through balance by exposing the mutual fears of the other. Wacousta can best be described as a nightmare. Honestly, reading it is full of surreal and supernatural experiences related to the place and identity of the peoples living in Canada. It's like a David Lynch film for the Great White North. But this nightmare is one that has the potential to be woken up from. And for Richardson and his vision of Canada, that means striking a balance between the so-called old and new worlds. It is not a speculative work, but it is one that gets to the heart of Canada's imagination about itself, and brings to light its need for definition. That definition often takes a turn for the fantastic. But then again, what about the way that Canada was developing wasn't surreal? Especially for those living through that moment. Okay, that is it for this episode. Thank you everyone for listening. You can reach out with any questions, comments, or concerns on the Facebook page, through Twitter, and by email. All links are in the description. As always, you can support the show through the Ko-fi page and through affiliate links in the recommended reading page I set up. Finally, if you could leave a review on iTunes, it would be very appreciated. It really does help to boost the show and get it to more people's ears. For now, I'll just wish you all excellent health, and that I hope you and your loved ones can stay safe in these intense times. I'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.